World's End, Hingham's prized possession. World's End is a quiet, peaceful sanctuary of a park located in Hingham, Massachusetts, whose name is believed to have reflected the lengths to which farmers were willing to travel to reach the property due to its rich soil and high prices for land. This peninsula that juts into Hingham Harbor consists of 251 acres, over 5 miles of shoreline, and a view of the Boston skyline 14 miles away. Its beauty couldn't help but attract commercial interest. However, none of its alternative fates, a housing subdivision, nuclear power plant, or the headquarters for the United Nations, ever came to be. Originally, the region was composed of towering mountains that were gradually worn down to about sea level. Then, 15,000 years ago, glaciers moved bedrock and loose sediment to carve hills and islands into Boston Harbor, devastating the countryside, but thus forming World's End. Much later, when these hills had ample vegetation, Native Americans roamed. These indigenous people were soon followed by colonial agriculturalists. However, the shift in formerly two discrete islands at high tide, these farmers connected the southernmost drumlin, Planters Hill, to the mainland in the 1600s, and also dammed the salt marsh to grow hay and cleared almost all of the trees for cropland. While there were multiple conflicting attempts to reconstruct the land of World's End, the trustees of reservations was successfully able to compromise with the pre-existing commercial interest, thus preserving its natural beauty and preventing it from further destruction. In 1856, World's End became part of a vast farming estate owned by businessman John Brewer. His property, which included the peninsula Sarah Island and Langley Island, was complete with livestock. Over the next 30 years, he acquired most of the 251 acres that now make up the reservation. In 1886, desiring to develop the farm into something greater, Brewer hired landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted to draw up plans to dissect World's End into a 163-lot subdivision to be used as house lots.
The lots are varied in size, and my understanding is that it's based on the value of the soil. So the larger the lots, not such good soil, not as good for farming as the lots that were smaller size. So really rich soil in the smaller lots, not as rich soil in the larger lots. So equally valued, just not equal in size.
Olmsted, a landscape architect who designed Central Park in New York City, created the official plan in 1890. Although the development never materialized, the carriage roads Olmsted designed were built and saplings were planted alongside them. Wilman Blackmar, a Hingham Civil War hero, married into the Brewer family in 1880 through John's daughter Helen. John Brewer continued farming until his death in 1893, and soon after the land came into possession of Wilman. As an avid preserver, Wilman terminated Olmsted's development plan and expanded the farm area. Wilman Brewer passed away in 1905, and with no children left his estate to his nephew Wilman Brewer, who shared his uncle's love for conservation. In 1944, Sarah and Langley Islands were generously gifted to the town of Hingham by William and Helen Walker, the latter of whom was Brewer's granddaughter. The Walker family, who were the property's last individual owners, kindly allowed visitors to wander the property and experience its beauty. Despite its ravages of hurricanes and natural disasters, World's End was wonderfully maintained by the couple. With the end of World War II, times were changing. Along with these changes came the idea of developing the United Nations. The United Nations was homeless when it officially came into existence on October 24, 1945. Many proposals were made for the development of World's End after World War II, including that in 1945 by a committee appointed by Governor Maurice Tobin, charged with the task of locating a site in the greater Boston area for the United Nations organization. It sought to establish its permanent headquarters in the eastern United States, with its relative proximity to Europe, preferably in a bedroom community around Boston or New York City. The site committee ruled out any urban locations because of the organization's sizable land requirements. The Hingham selectmen and many residents were all for the proposal. Excited at thought of a more diverse and lively town, and proud of recently winning the war. However, when millionaire philanthropist John D. Rockefeller Jr. surprisingly offered a gift of 6 blocks of Manhattan real estate along the East River in December 1946, the committee was drawn to the thriving city. Despite World's End being violent, several large-scale developers made more offers for the land in the 50s and 60s. In 1965, the New England Electric System and the Boston Edison Electric Company were seriously considering World's End as a nuclear power plant site. However, the plant was eventually built in Plymouth, where it remains today. Although putting nuclear power at a setting called World's End would have been a beautifully symbolic gesture, this plan also fell by the wayside due to the town's passionate objection. When the Walkers put World's End up for sale in the mid-20th century, the idea that it might become a golf course or private residence was too much for locals to bear. The people in Hingham and the surrounding area had, to some degree, become accustomed to how beautiful it was, says Tom O'Donnell, a Hingham resident, longtime town moderator, and veteran of the trustees' all-volunteer standing committee. He adds, "The notion that it would no longer be available for public enjoyment was horrifying for the people who were used to it." Considering how fond of the land Hingham residents had become, the Walkers wanted to see the property reserved, but they did not want to lose any money through their preservation. Founded in 1891 by Charles Eliot, an open space visionary and prodigy of Olmsted, the Trustees of Reservations are the nation's oldest statewide nonprofit land conservation trust. The trustees expressed interest in taking over the land for many years prior when Lawrence B. Fletcher, the former executive secretary of the organization, made inquiries to attaining the area for the organization. The catch and the compromise. The organization needed to raise $650,000 to purchase the property by the December 31st, 1967 deadline. That left them with simply 2.5 months to raise the required $200,000 initial payment. Locals who had faith in the trustees stewarding their special place helped out by fundraising. School children donated their allowances, and passionate residents reached into their wallets. The use of state or federal funds, then more available for land conservation projects, was rejected, but local leaders were certain that the full sum could be raised from the private sector. In the end, 1,800 individuals made donations in only 6 weeks, and thus the purchase was secure. After the trustees paid $200,000 upfront, an office at Town Hall was set up. After purchasing it in 1967, the Trustees of Reservations designated World's End a park available to all, and today it serves as one of the trustees' most iconic properties. The pre-existing artificial landscape of World's End would have further been harmed with the propositions. However, with assistance from the trustees' reservation, the land was able to be prevented from becoming more unnatural. Despite the compromise that solved many of the reservation's previous problems, World's End's recurring commercial appeal will continue to hinder its natural success. Even today, its popularity, vulnerability to storm surges and microbursts, and field susceptibility to pests, disease, and invasive plant species prove to be challenges for the reservation. In 2016, the trustees proposed an expansion plan that called for 60% more parking and a new 1,400 square foot visitor center within World's End. Fearing that this would take away from its alluring scenery, Hingham residents started a petition in order to stop this development. For each problem, whether it's passionate supporters of World's End or the trustees themselves, there's a solution in the making. The thriving park and everything it has overcome is a testament to its staying power.